Okay, before we do anything else, I want to review some of the ideas that we've been covering in this section on social epistemology, starting with a root idea for a lot of what we've been covering, and that is the idea of good faith. Um, Basically, a lot of the tactics that we are studying in this section come from situations where people are operating in bad faith. A standard model of critical thinking just assumes that everyone is reasoning cooperatively towards a common end. But in most real world situations, you can't count on that, especially on the internet and especially today, in today's political environment. So, first, I want to talk about good faith and bad faith, then review some of the other concepts that come up in the context of bad faith discussions, and then um, we will get to the new ideas about things like bullshit and propaganda and doubt. Okay, so good faith. A person reasons together with someone else in good faith. They are making an honest effort to find the truth. If they try to follow the rules for conversation, both implicit and explicit, and if they practice intellectual empathy. So, the notion of good faith came originally from the law, and contract law in particular. You negotiate in good faith if you aren't trying to deceive. You follow through on a contract in good faith if you do your best to live up to the obligations of the contract. So the important thing here is that good faith is about intent and not outcome, right? So you can try and follow a contract in good faith and still screw up, but as long as you're doing your best, it was good faith, right? And the same thing applies with reasoning. We don't expect you necessarily to follow the rules of reasoning perfectly, or the rules of any conversation perfectly, but we assume that you're trying. Uh, Quick note, in the first version of this slide that I posted, I neglected to include the clause that's here in red, um, making an honest effort to find the truth. I think it's very important for a notion of good faith that we've got an idea that the truth is independent of anyone's interests, and we are trying to figure out, what is true about the world. I just left that out by accident. So, in our previous discussion of good faith, we also looked at bad faith situations. And I feel like these are incredibly common these days. And there's a quote that I like to use in a lot of internet situations. This is from the philosopher Jean Paul Sartre, who lived in Nazi occupied Paris for all of World War II. Um, he was initially a prisoner of war, but he was released and just was a civilian. This is from a book called Anti-Semite and Jew, which is actually not very good because Sartre doesn't understand Judaism, but he had intimate knowledge of anti-Semites and Nazis and understood well how they worked. Um, so what he said is, never believe that anti-Semites are completely unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know that their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge, but they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. The anti-Semite has the right to play. They even like to play with the discourse, for by giving ridiculous reasons, they discredit the seriousness of their interlocutors. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert. And it's well worth noting that this continues to be the practice of online trolls, including Nazi trolls. There was a website called the Daily Stormer, which was a Nazi website that had its own style guide, believe it or not. Um, and they specified doing more or less exactly what Sartre talks about here. Um, the tone of the site should be light. The unindoctrinated should not be able to tell if we are joking or not. Um, and then the underlying truth is that they're not joking. They really do want to commit genocide. Um, so again, it's this playful attitude of trolls. They think they're playing, but really they're bullying, or their idea of playing is bullying. All right. So in this context, we also talked about gaslighting, um, which is psychologically manipulating people to get them to question their own perceptions and sanity. Again, this could come across as a joke, but it's not. This is the behavior common behavior in abusive relationships. So the name comes from the 1944 movie Gaslight, which was actually originally a play, where a man deliberately drives his wife insane so that he can get the jewels hidden in her attic. Um, and you can watch clips for it online. In fact, you can watch the whole movie. It's a great movie. Um, so gaslighting, that's something that happens when people are operating in bad faith. Trolling happens when people are operating in bad faith. Generally, trolling means any attempt to provoke someone into an unproductive argument. I think it had a more narrow meaning when it first came out, and I think it's actually that narrow meaning is important to highlight because it was specifically about undermining community, an online community. The term arose during the blogging era, but it still applies to contemporary online communities, social media groups, Discord servers, whatever. So you try to undermine a community by provoking argument while pretending to be a member of the community. Okay. Concern trolling we talked about was to troll someone while pretending to be concerned with their welfare. And this has a large overlap with gaslighting tactics. We saw in the movie Gaslight that Gregory, the gaslighter, um, undermines Paula's confidence in her own sanity by constantly saying that he's concerned for her sanity and wants to help. Sea lioning is to harass someone while pretending to want to engage in good faith reasoning. This is from the cartoon by David Malky. Again, this is all review. So those are some of the things that people who are operating in bad faith do. Now let's move on to talk about bullshit. So you might be surprised to hear the word bullshit in a critical thinking class, but actually bullshit has come to be a technical term in philosophy and critical thinking. And that's because a philosopher by the name of Harry Frankfurt wrote an essay called On Bullshit, which I think kind of started as a fairly dry joke, but it had an important insight, and then it got republished as its own little book. And it's been quite popular, and I think it's spawned a lot of good thinking. So bullshit in the technical sense means an attempt to persuade made by someone who is utterly indifferent to the truth of their statements. I might want to expand attempt to persuade there. I might want to say any speech made by someone who is utterly indifferent to the truth of their statements. So this is what Harry Frankfurt said on Bullshit. It is impossible for someone to lie unless he thinks he knows the truth. Producing bullshit requires no such conviction. A person who lies is thereby responding to the truth, and he is to that extent respectful of it. When an honest man speaks, he says only what he believes to be true, and for the liar, it is correspondingly indispensable that he considers his statements to be false. For the bullshitter, however, all these bets are off. He is neither on the side of the true nor the false. His eye is not on the facts at all, as the eyes of the honest man are. and of the liar are, except insofar as they might be pertinent to getting away with what he says. And so he then says that bullshit is a greater enemy of truth than lies are. And I think that's right, and I think we're seeing that play out. So one of the things that Harry Frankfurt's book on bullshit spawned was another book called Calling Bullshit. And I've got a little bit here in the PowerPoint. I'm going to skip over it, and you can skip over that as well. It won't be on the test for this semester. So we're going to skip this. One thing I do want to talk about this semester is Brandolini's bullshit asymmetry principle. So Brandolini is an Italian programmer who noticed that, this is the way he puts it. The amount of energy necessary to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce it. So basically, you have to work 10 times as hard to refute bullshit as the bullshitter has to work to produce it. So you're at a 10-to-1 disadvantage when you try to refute a bullshitter. You're going to go in, you're going to do all your homework, you're going to do your due diligence, you're going to make a good faith effort to show why all his statements were false. And then he'll just spew out some more because it's easy. And this is also part of the reason for the observation that Frankfurt gives at the beginning of his book on bullshit. He says, the interesting thing about bullshit is how much of it there is. One of the things that I want to emphasize in this section is that the reason that there's a lot of bullshit is that it's easy to make, and that also it has uses. You can successfully stymie people with bullshit. So that's important. So let me just summarize here. The essence of bullshit is not the truth of the statements, but the bad faith of the bullshitter. Furthermore, weaponized bullshit is an important propaganda tool because it spreads mistrust. Bullshit is useful for trolling, for gaslighting, for all sorts of things. Refuting bullshit is often more work than it's worth. So I want to transition to talking about propaganda. Oh, well, I got one comment on propaganda, and then we'll talk about doubt, which was a specific propaganda campaign. So, incoherence is one of the goals here, right? The point of bullshit actually sometimes is to be incoherent. It's effective because it's incoherent. They talk about chaos agents when you read intel stuff. This is a editor at Snopes, writer and editor at Snopes. Snopes is a debunking site that we talked about when we talked about evaluating sources on the internet. In any case, she gave an interview with the journalist Lindsay Beierstein on a podcast called The Breach, and she said, incoherence is one of the goals here. They talk about chaos agents when you read intel stuff, that is the work of actual intelligence agents. There are always these chaos agents trying to throw wrenches of uncertainty into any one narrative. I think the incoherence is a part of the narrative. And that helps us transition to a discussion of doubt. Doubt. Weaponized doubt was the primary tool of the most effective propaganda campaign of the 20th century. And this was the propaganda campaign conducted by the cigarette industry to suppress or at least neutralize the knowledge that cigarettes caused cancer. This strategy was announced in a memo from someone at Brown and Williamson, which was a tobacco company. And And this memo was released as a part of the tobacco industry settlement, where the tobacco industry basically admitted everything that was going on and had to pay huge fines that now go into anti-smoking campaigns and accept much more regulation. At some point, in 1969, in the an unknown executive, Ed Brown and Williamson, wrote a memo saying, "Gout is our product, since it is." Let's see if I can read this right. Gout is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. So the other important piece of background information here is that by 1969, the tobacco industry had amassed ample evidence in its internal private research that cigarettes caused cancer. They knew at that point that they were dealing a lethal drug. They knew better than the outside scientists. They had the best research on this topic locked up. Their goal was to figure out how to continue to sell their product, even though they knew that very quickly other people would come to understand that their product is deadly. So that's when they launched their campaign of doubt. All of this is outlined in a book called Merchants of Doubt by Oreskes and Conway. That's what I had you read for this class. Here's some quotes from it. "Doubt is our product," ran the infamous memo written by one tobacco industry executive in 1969, "since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public." The industry defended its primary product, tobacco, by manufacturing something else. Doubt about its harm. No doubt became the mantra they would use again and again in the 1990s when attention turned to secondhand smoke. It also became the mantra of nearly every campaign in the last quarter century to fight facts. So, to be clear, initially the tobacco industry had to suppress the knowledge that tobacco caused cancer. They also suppressed the knowledge of just how addictive tobacco was. And finally, they had to neutralize at least the knowledge that secondhand smoke was deadly. Before the research around secondhand smoke, a lot of people could say, well, yeah, these cigarettes are killing you, but, it's your life, do what you want. But once it became clear that other people, including like children, were being impacted by the secondhand smoke from their parents, people really turned against the tobacco industry. So that was, again, another situation where they had to sow doubt in order to keep people from regulating them. They couldn't suppress the scientific knowledge completely, but as long as people had some doubt that cigarettes caused cancer, the cigarette companies could continue to operate in public the way they were used to. Part of their campaign of doubt, and this is in the chapter that you read, I think this is important, was work by the Tobacco Institute and the work of two scientists, Fred Seitz and Fred Singer. From 1979 to 1985, Fred Seitz directed a program for R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company that distributed $45 million to scientists around the country for biomedical research that could generate evidence and cultivate experts to be used in court to defend the product. They invested money to slow down science by hiring other scientists. In the mid-1990s, Fred Singer co-authored a major report asking the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, attacking the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency over the health risks of secondhand smoke. So again, these two guys named Fred were the leads in the campaign by the tobacco companies to instill doubt around the connection between cigarettes and cancer, to allow the tobacco companies to continue to operate in public. All right. It's important to recognize that this tactic, which was so successful for tobacco, has been repeated again and again by other important industries. And the biggest one is the fossil fuel industry and evidence for global warming. So in 1990, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released their first report. And I personally mark this as the time that we really knew that the world was getting warmer. There had been speculation for like 100 years, as much as 100 years prior to that, 90 years. But the way science works, when you get a body of people like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change together, these are people who had come from all around the world, all sorts of different specialties, all sorts of different disciplines. They worked together and reached this conclusion. That counts as a scientific consensus. So that happened in 1990. We knew that the Earth was getting warmer. In 1995, the IPCC released its second report, saying not only is the Earth getting warmer, but we are the cause of the Earth getting warmer. So this sets the stage for all climate negotiations ever since. That section of the paper was authored by a guy named Ben Santer. He was the one who wrote up the summary of all the scientists' evidence. Ben Santer then became subject of a harassment campaign. And who led the harassment campaign? Actually, Fred Seitz and Fred Singer. So it's not just the same tactic. For a long time, it's been the same people. Okay, so this gets us to an important concept, agnogenesis. It's a big fancy word, but when you break it apart, you can figure out what it means. So Genesis, is beginning, like in the beginning, the book of Genesis. No, Gno, is short for gnosis, which is the Greek word for knowledge. And A means not, like anti. So agnogenesis is the creation of anti-knowledge. It is the deliberate production of ignorance or neutralization of knowledge so it does not lead to action. This is a term that was specifically coined after the revelations of the tobacco industry's campaign to promote doubt around the link between cigarettes and cancer. It's an important propaganda tactic. So it's one that we need to study if we're going to study social epistemology. All right. Okay, so bullshit and doubt, I've been emphasizing, are two tools for propaganda. Again, this is all what happens when people operate in bad faith. Propaganda, bullshit, trolling. Propaganda is basically what happens when bad faith actors operate together on a social scale as an organized campaign. I want to give you a little bit of the philosophy of propaganda, how philosophers have understood propaganda to work. Okay, there are basically two theories of propaganda. There is the belief first tradition. And this actually goes all the way back to Karl Marx talking about ideology. But this is the tradition that assumes that the purpose of propaganda is simply to create false belief. There's an alternate tradition that I call the holist tradition. It gets called a bunch of other different things. But it emphasizes that there are a variety of ways that propaganda can act besides just creating false beliefs. Propaganda does more than deceive. For starters, we've already seen it can sow chaos. The interesting thing is that the holist tradition is based in the writings of, among other things, actual propagandists. Going back to Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, and um, other people who worked in the World War I Office of Public Information, which was the US office that sort of developed the tools of modern propaganda. Okay. So, background history. The holist theory, or sometimes we call it the practiced first theory. Actually, I include Jean-Paul Sartre, who we've already met, talking about anti-Semites in this. Also, Hannah Arendt, who was another person who survived Nazi Germany. She had to flee because she was Jewish. She came to the United States. She wrote a book called um, Origins of Totalitarianism, which studied the tactics of Hitler and Stalin, whom she believed were unique in the history of dictators because of the scope, their ambition. They were totalitarian, they weren't just authoritarian. So again, Arendt, I think, had some keen insights into the way that dictators, totalitarians operate in propaganda. Another key guy is Jacques Ellul, a French guy who wrote mostly in the 60s. And then at the bottom, there are three contemporary philosophers whom I like a lot who are working on this subject. Megan Hiska, Corey Wimberly, and the guy you can't see quite as well because the picture is dim is Olufemi Taiwo. You don't need to know these names. This is just general background. I think the thing that I do want you to understand is that propaganda does more than just deceive. I want to talk about this. What else does it do? Well, we've already seen propaganda can bully and it can troll, right? Um, It can show a regime's power. This is actually a form of state propaganda that Megan Hiska emphasizes. She draws on sources who were looking at propaganda produced by the Chinese Communist Party and the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The propaganda like that puts out statements that are not just false, but so obviously false that it's clear that the regime doesn't actually intend the audience to believe it. So one example was that Bashar al-Assad is a great pharmacist. What? Oh, he is a dictator. He doesn't know anything about chemistry. But the people weren't supposed to believe it. It was a show of the regime's power that they could get everyone to repeat this obviously false statement. Okay. Propaganda controls what kinds of issues can be broached publicly. This is important for a lot of contemporary propaganda. Things that previously were off limits because they were just too racist can become acceptable subjects of conversation again just by introducing the ideas, even if no one actually believes them. And so this is an important tactic of contemporary white supremacists, among other things. Propaganda shapes perceptions of salience. I talked about this in reference to cults and emergent religions and religious abuse. We mentioned that Thi Nguyen, when talking about echo chambers, compares them to the work of cults. However, I didn't like the term cult because a cult combines two ideas. One is that it's a new religion, and the other is that it is a abusive religion. But religious abuse isn't the sole domain of emergent religions. Plenty of established religions, long established religions, engage in the same kind of religious abuse that emergent religions do. So what happens with a word like cult is it functions as propaganda. It shapes your understanding of salience. That salience just means relevance. If your primary association when you think religious abuse is a new religion, it takes the heat off of old religions that are also engaged in the same kind of projects. So yeah, just a word like cult can serve as a propaganda tool. Propaganda controls perceptions of expertise, can create social incentives and disincentives for different forms of speech, and it can transform individuals' identities. I'm not going to require you to know these. I'm just trying to illustrate the idea, the underlying idea, that propaganda can do so much more than simply give you a false belief. The final one on the list is transform individuals' identities. And this is what Edward Bernays, the father of modern public relations and really the father of modern advertising, emphasized. Um, he said his goal wasn't to get people to buy products, it was to create consumers. You want to identify with the product. I'm a Ford driver. I have a pickup truck making fun of a bumper sticker on my truck, making fun of Chevy drivers. You identify with the product. It goes far deeper than giving you a false belief or even creating a false act or a desired action. It shapes your identity. And Bernays went so far as to say that creating consumers as an identity is the most important job of public relations in the industrial era. Because right now, industry is producing stuff, products, faster than people can consume them. So we need to get people to identify as consumers so that they can buy more stuff. Bernays was explicit that this was his goal. This was back in the 1920s. Final thing I want to say is that propaganda has the ability to either nurture or suppress group agency. Group agency just means people acting together for a purpose, acting as one group. So things happen when people act together in groups. Things don't happen when they can't act together in groups. So if you can disrupt your opposition's attempt to form a group that can act together, you win. That's something propaganda can do. It can also do the reverse. It can bring unity to your own group so that your group can act together. This is the central function of political action. Okay, I want to close this section with some quotes from Hannah Arendt. She was one of the philosophers who lived through Nazi oppression and had some insights into how Nazis operate. So this is again from Origins of Totalitarianism. The assumption of a Jewish world conspiracy was transformed by totalitarian propaganda from an objectionable, arguable matter into the chief element of Nazi reality. So the Nazis, I'm breaking off from the quote here, were adamant that the whole reason that Germany had lost World War I is that they were stabbed in the back. They were betrayed by Jews. Otherwise, the natural superiority of the Aryan race would have caused them to win World War I. So there's the idea that there's a Jewish world conspiracy against the Aryan people. And in the Nazi movement, this just becomes an element of Nazi reality. Returning to the quote, the point was that the Nazis acted as though the world were dominated by Jews and needed a counter-conspiracy to defend itself. Racism then was no longer a debatable theory of dubious scientific value, but was realized every day in the functioning hierarchy of a political organization in whose framework it would have been very unrealistic to question it. Once Nazis had created their movement, their social movement, created that group agency, people in that movement were no longer able to question the idea of a Jewish conspiracy. So this is the basic summary of Arendt's idea of how propaganda works. Propaganda creates the social movement. The social movement creates the belief. Propaganda does not typically work directly to create false belief. Propaganda, Nazi propaganda, totalitarian propaganda created the totalitarian social movement. And then once you're embedded in that social movement, there is no questioning the beliefs of that social movement. This circles back to what we were talking about with the reading from Helene de Cruz when she talked about believing to belong, where, people will, in order to show that they belong to a group, will profess certain beliefs. So, for instance, in order to show that you're a certain kind of Christian, you will profess not to believe in evolution. And this is true even if you've never studied the origins of animals or really even needed to have an opinion on how animals came to be the way they are, right? The function of the belief is not to give an assessment of the evidence about where animal shapes come from. It's just to signal your membership in a group. Here's some more Arendt. Without the force of the movement, its members cease at once to believe in the dogma for which yesterday they were ready to sacrifice their lives. The moment the movement, that is, the fictitious world that sheltered them, is destroyed, the masses revert to their old status as isolated individuals, not part of a group agent, who are either happily accept the new function of the changed world or sink back into their old desperate superfluousness. Right? Okay, so with this insight, I want to return to what's going on with John Brakey, the guy that we had our exercise about. Okay, so remember from the beginning of this presentation that Brakey is the guy who is trying to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the 2020 election vote in Arizona. And his claim was, and you saw a video where he did this, that 40,000 ballots were smuggled from Asia and used, somehow snuck into the ballot count in Arizona. And he was requiring election workers to scan the ballots with a high resolution camera to look for bamboo fibers, which he said would be evidence that the ballots came from China. So right away, I hope what you can see is that this is bullshit. His story doesn't actually make sense. Why, other than some racist association between bamboo and China, would there be bamboo fiber on the ballots? Does he think that people in China just walk around smearing bamboo on things? Does he think Chinese paper is made out of anything different than paper anywhere else? It's part of a world production system. It's just wood pulp. Can these cameras even detect bamboo fiber? And even more importantly, why is China even a part of this? What are American forged ballots so inferior that we had to import ballots from China? Okay, so look at what I just did there. First of all, I gave you a whole bunch of reasons why what Brakey is doing is bullshit. But I was also playing into his stratagem because I was arguing with him, right? And when I argue with him, he has a 10-to-1 advantage against me because of Brandolini's bullshit asymmetry principle. He can just come up with more bullshit. And, to this day, election denialism is going crazy in Arizona. There's a county in the South, I think, where they want to change the rules so that elections have to take place in one day, only in-person voting, and always be counted by hand and not machines. Now, is counting by hand actually more reliable than machine counting? I don't know. I mean, personally, I wouldn't trust myself to count much past 100. Um, but that doesn't matter. Because again, it's bullshit. I want to talk about what Breaky is doing as propaganda. So these are things that he's accomplishing besides giving you false beliefs. So he doesn't really think you believe that bamboo is evidence that ballots came from China, and ballots coming from China is evidence that they're forgeries. He's bullying election workers, right? He's making them review things that they already did that he knows and they know are completely legitimate. He's expanding the range of what can be said in public. Um, Now casting doubt on elections that have been certified by all the appropriate officials is a legitimate thing to do. He's taking up public attention. He's creating a social reality in which the truth of his absurd assertions must go unquestioned. That is, he's creating a social reality like the Nazi movement, where certain ideas just are part of the movement and they're not questioned by members of the movement. So the Nazis didn't question the existence of a Jewish world conspiracy. The people in the Stop the Steal movement don't question the existence of a conspiracy to falsify the election. All right. And so an important quote here that I've used before and I want to emphasize again is from Donald Trump's campaign manager, Steve Bannon. Again, it's on the topic of bullshit. He said, Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. He's talking about these low quality theories that just create confusion. All right. So when you attempt to argue with Breaky, which is what I was trying to do, what I was saying things like, well, why is bamboo fiber evidence that something came from China? You're actually playing into his hands as a bullshitter. Um, you emphasize his power to raise absurdities. That helps him bully election workers. You grant legitimacy to his argument. You further expand the range of what can be said in public. You further squander public attention, and you reinforce the echo chamber. All right. So propaganda around the allegedly stolen 2020 election works the same way that Nazi propaganda does. Stop the Steal propaganda itself creates the Stop the Steal as a social movement, which in turn creates the belief that the election was stolen. All right, one final concept, and then we'll be out of here for this section on bad faith actors. Stochastic terrorism. Stochastic terrorism is a form of terrorism which occurs when a media figure publicly demonizes a group in a way that incites random acts of violence from unstable members of the audience. Stochastic terrorism isn't really all that new. We're seeing a lot of it in the internet age, but really it's as old as printing. You need some kind of mass media to engage in stochastic terrorism, but after that, it's been something that's been done for a long time. The term was originally coined in 2011 by a blogger who went by the name G2 Geek, who gave two examples of propaganda from that time. The propaganda videos put out by Osama bin Laden was one. Osama bin Laden would put out these propaganda videos about the glory of um, Islam and the evil of the United States. And this would encourage suicide bombers and other terrorists like the 9/11 attackers. The other example that G2 Geek gave was the broadcasts of Glenn Beck, who claimed that the Sandy Hook shooting was a hoax and sparked random people to harass victims of the children family members of the victims of Sandy Hook. Um, so G2 Geek said that the resulting violence of stochastic terrorism is statistically predictable. You know that something's going to happen, but individually unpredictable. Each individual person who flies off the handle, there's no way to predict that it was going to be that person. I should emphasize now, and I know this is a sensitive topic, but sometimes we need to speak clearly about sensitive topics in order to understand. Both the government of Israel and Hamas are engaged in stochastic terrorism right now. So there are anti-Semitic attacks happening all over the world, including the United States, and Islamophobic attacks, including in Chicago, where a guy just murdered a 6-year-old boy. All of this is the result of stochastic terrorism on the part of the combatants in the Middle East right now. Okay, so that's what I've got to say on this collection of bad faith actors, the tactics of bad faith actors. Use the information in this PowerPoint to fill in your review sheet, and you'll be ready for the test.